Hello and welcome to Total Education Media's lecture series. Tonight we're going to talk about Blade Runner, and especially we've got some questions here from students. These questions have been sent to me either through the website or through our YouTube channel, which is what you're watching now, and we're going to answer those questions as best we can tonight and try and work our way through some of the intricacies and problems with Blade Runner. Don't forget, we have a website where you can purchase stuff, and there's some excellent lectures on Blade Runner which add detail to what I'm going to say tonight. Don't forget to keep these free. Please press the like button down below and we'll keep supplying you with this information as best we can. Let's look at our first question tonight. How does Blade Runner demonstrate the concept of science versus religion? And that's an excellent question because it does stem from the Romantic era and linking back to some of the earlier things that we looked at in Frankenstein. But Blade Runner does demonstrate the concept of science versus religion, because what it does is it actually replaces religion with science. What we see is a world dominated by science, and certainly dominated by the Tyrell Corporation. And that corporation, run by Tyrell himself, has taken over pretty much the whole world, and what they've done is they're supplying not only the science behind the replicants, but they're supplying most of the necessities and consumer goods on Earth, and it's that sense of mass consumerism gone crazy, and the science of worship of science, and the propensity of science to just take it to the nth extreme. And I think that's a really good question, because if you look at it in those terms, where science is the new religion, and look what's happened to the world. So it's very important in that sense to focus on how the film portrays science, and that portrayal then goes and shows the values of science and the values of how Ridley Scott sees scientific advancement when it's not checked and moulded by ethics and values. That sense of consumerism and mass production gone rampant in a world, and look what it's done to the world. It's basically destroyed it. So that's an excellent question to think about, and thank you for that question. The next question from one of our audience is Deckett's drinking related to personal issues, e.g. retiring? Yes, of course. Deckett's drinking is related to personal issues in many ways. We see Deckett right at the start, and there's another video lecture on Deckett where we go into this in complete detail. But just to answer this question, Deckett's personal issues come about because he's certainly disenchanted at the start of the film, and what happens is he's retired, he's dragged out of retirement, he's made do all the things he doesn't want to do. And if we look at him in this sense, he's sort of, and I'm going to read here a definition, he's a sort of, as we talked about in his character study, he's a film noir character. And now the definition of film noir is a motion picture with an often grim urban setting, photographed in sombre tones and permeated by a feeling of disillusionment, pessimism and despair. And that certainly is what Deckett brings to the film in many ways, especially at the start. He's absolutely pessimistic. He has to be dragged back into doing what he wants to, well, what he doesn't want to do. And, you know, as Bryant says to him, if you're not one of us, you're one of the little people. And he's forced back into a world that he doesn't want to be in. And that despair and pessimism does lead him to drink. That's also part of the affect of that film noir detective, which I'll talk about in the specific video on Deckett. But it does fit into that mould of that 1950s film noir detective, the hard-boiled, hard-drinking detective. So that's an excellent question, and yes, it does. Another question: how does the soundtrack in Blade Runner enhance or change the film? What does it add to it? Well, the Vangelis soundtrack has been talked about for decades now, and what it does for the film. The haunting opening scene, for example, where that overlaid music plays to the panning camera as we look at the city and the world as it is in the future. What it does is it adds to and sets the sound, and it gives us that tension, that feeling of tension as we move in and look around. And each time the music plays, it's that haunting feeling, and it goes directly back to that sense of film noir, that sense of disillusionment and despair, and it's in the background haunting. And it certainly has been commented on and acclaimed as an integral part of the film, and it adds to our overall impression and tone. So my suggestion is, when you're talking about mood and tone, if you're referring to the film, and the contribution to that, the music to that is extremely significant. Okay, what's some more questions? What are some of the techniques for nature of humanity in the film? That's a very general question. I'll talk specifically about film techniques for a moment, if I may. And if you look at very carefully, the better candidates in the HSC always focus on film technique and how those techniques contribute to the author's, or in this case the director's, sense of giving us values, thematic concerns, showing us values. And so I think it's very important and a very good question. Film techniques that you need to comment on are things like camera angles. So for example, a long wide shot which gives us a big panorama. The close-ups, especially the close-ups of Rachel or the close-ups of Deckard in those scenes, showing us emotion and extremes of emotion, and all the shots in between. And we look at how the film's cut and what that does and how that portrays. So one example of that exactly might be, we see the shock on Rachel's face with the realisation when Deckard tells her she's a replicant. So of course we're going to get a close-up there, so we get the full gist of that, and the impact of that is to create a sense of empathy for Rachel, and that sense of empathy, of course, then comes back to the audience and gives us a feeling that yes, we have a sympathy with her, and we do think that, you know, she deserves more, and that she has human qualities and all those sorts of things that go along with that. So I think that's a good question again, because if we focus on technique and we use and integrate technique into our essays, we certainly can make sure that that comes across very clearly. What else is there? Specifically, that sense of humanity that we've talked about, and the whole ethos of the film discusses what is humanity, what do we strive for, and of course that's a whole topic in itself, and one that we will deal with in these later lectures when we understand the film fully. But for now, techniques of humanity, the one of Rachel, for example, that I've suggested, but also a sense of empathy for the humanity of the characters. You might like to choose a scene such as when Zora's murdered by Deckard, and he shoots her in the back, and he shoots her multiple times, and she pounds her way through the glass and splatters on the floor, and there's blood everywhere. And it's a very horrifying scene, and again, if we refer back to the previous question, the music comes through and the slow motion and all that sense, and all it does is create a sense of empathy with her, and we understand her fight for life and her struggle for life, and I think that's extremely important in the film, that we understand that, and that's what makes the characters become human in inverted commas for us, and that we have sort of that empathy and sympathy with them and push forward along those lines. And one of the values that I think that Ridley Scott does do through showing that these creatures, the replicants, have specific values, is that we then relate to them much better, and they want to live and we want to live, and they're all qualities, and we don't see them as normal humans do in the movie as skin jobs. We see them as living, breathing beings who have come back to Earth just to want to live. And I think that scene where Zora's shot is a key example of how Ridley Scott shows that, and that's very important. Some more questions. The sun image, as seen from Tyrell's window, does it have any significance? Well, that's another excellent question, and there's been some debate over that sun image, whether it's real or not. I think the sun image in that film is real, and I think it's because Tyrell's building rises above the Earth. We can see the Earth has no diurnal range down on the ground level. It's always dark, it's always lit, it's always raining. And I think the feeling that Ridley Scott tries to convey there is a sense of the whole ecosystem of the world has been destroyed, and that we don't have any sort of natural light left and natural wonders left, because the layer of pollution is so great. When we get out of that pollution and rise up, as we do in Eldon Tyrrell's pyramid, that Mayan pyramid type shape, it's above that, and it rises above, and he's isolated up there, and I think we see the sun through that, and I think that's very important. I think the sun coming up is only for him in many ways, and that the ordinary people don't get that sun. And the earth is, there's certainly layers of wealth in the earth, and I would imagine that someone like Tyrrell doesn't have many equals or any equals on earth, and a lot of the rich, of course, have got off earth and gone off world anyway. And what's left down the bottom is that decaying layer that we see so much. And we see that decay through the rain and the Art Deco buildings, and how nothing works, and the malfunctioning and all those sorts of things. And that goes back to setting, of course. So I think that sun image, when it does come up, it is very important. It shows the differentiation between the rich and the poor, and that's one of the things, of course, that comes from that 80s context that Ridley Scott was so enamoured with, and I think he wanted to show that that was one of the issues that the film gets into. And the other thing with the sun is, if it is the real sun, and I think we come to some sort of consensus on that, you can come to that consensus for yourself, of course, and argue against it. Some people say it's artificial, and Tyrrell has the window and it shuts it out, but I think probably, going back, it's real, and that he shuts it out. Notice how he shuts it out, because he has to do the Voigt-Kampff test on Rachel, and so any sort of natural light, we know, is gone. It's also important in that scene to think about when Rachel first comes in, and Deckard asks her about the owl, and is it natural, is it real, and she says of course not, as if it wouldn't be. There's nothing natural left on earth, and nothing real. And I think that's how they have to create their own nature to get back to earth, and I think that's one of the links that you'll take back to other texts. Well, we're getting near the end of this now, but we still have some final questions. How do the themes, nature of humanity and scientific discovery, relate back to the context and to the composer? Well, if we look at Blade Runner itself and Ridley Scott, and if you watch the first video in this series, the pretext and context lecture, you'll understand the answer to that very carefully. I think this question is getting back to, linking it back to the concept of Frankenstein and the nature of humanity and scientific discovery, and I think you'll find that Ridley Scott very much has the same sort of attitude as Mary Shelley had in Frankenstein, because we don't see that untrammeled science in a very positive way at all. Eldon Tyrrell is portrayed extremely negatively, and when he dies, certainly a horrible death, and we're semi-repulsed by his death, but we don't have a lot of sympathy for him. We have certainly, I think, more sympathy for Roy and his longing for life and what he's seen and done, whereas Tyrrell sees everything certainly in monetary and consumer terms. He sees everything as commerce, and we see that life doesn't mean anything to him, and it's very important that life doesn't mean anything to him, in the sense that if he can't commercialise it and can't sell it, then it's not important. I certainly will return to that theme of what is human and what makes human, what makes people as such, and humanity, and I'll certainly refer to that in another lecture, and we'll go into more detail. But thank you for those questions. Please keep them coming in. Certainly don't forget to press the like button down below us, and if you have any questions, you can either refer them through email or make a comment on the YouTube channel, and I'll answer your questions as promptly as I possibly can. Thanks again for your attendance. Don't forget, visit our website. There's plenty of lectures on Blade Runner and other topics that will help you succeed in your studies. That's all now from Total Education Centre Media. Thank you.